lesson is going to be on multiplying and dividing negative numbers. So when we talked about adding and subtracting negative numbers, there was a lot of processing to do to maybe get to an answer. We had the three rules that we follow, and today we're going to add two more rules to that, so rule number 4 and number 5, that are a little simpler in understanding, but once you have them memorized, your skill will be something that you'll have when you multiply and divide negative numbers. So the handout that I gave you in our last lesson when you came to class, if you saw on the front side, it was adding and subtracting negative numbers, and then on the back side we're working with multiplying and dividing with the two rules we'll talk about in this lesson today. So you can always use that as a reference, fill it out as you were asked to do on the front side, and then you always have that to look at. Also, besides trying to memorize these rules, and there is some thinking that will get confusing, and we'll talk about that also as we go along in this lesson. So we're going to talk about rule number 4, and that rule number 4 has to do with if I have one negative number in my problem, and always remember we only can work with two numbers at a time in math. So if one is a negative number, then so if I say that's step 1, step 2 would be then I always have a negative answer. So if I have one negative number, it's always going to be a negative answer if this is the factor, or if I am sort of working backwards and I have one of the factors and the answer. And so again, if one of those numbers is negative, the other guy I'm trying to find, if it's the other factor or the answer, whichever way it is, it's going to be negative. That is always a rule to remember and memorize. So one negative number, you always have a negative answer. And then do your operation, and this is whether it's multiplying or dividing. This follows both multiplying and dividing. Do your operation of multiplying or dividing absolute values again. So I do not want to think about that negative sign. Once I know that answer is going to be negative, just right away go to absolute values and solve it, just like you do a normal multiplying or dividing problem. Let's use one as an example here of, let's take 2 times a negative 4. I put the parentheses there just to have your symbol again away from that negative sign. And you could also look at this as we understand multiplication. Now that parentheses are involved, you can put a number right beside another number, and that means multiplying. So either way, you could have this look. And so I go by the rule. I have one negative number, so right away I know my answer is going to be negative. Absolutely, it goes negative. So I've got that taken care of, it's out of my mind. And then I can do absolute values, and without thinking of any signs, and I just say 2 times 4 is 8, and that would be my answer then, negative 8. So one negative number, automatically it takes that to a negative answer, and then just do absolute values and solve it, and you've got that problem taken care of. Division works the same way. Let's say I have a negative 8 divided by 2. So it doesn't matter. Again, I have one negative. I know my answer is going to be negative automatically. And so I just take absolute values, just digit divided by digit, 8 divided by 2 is 4, so my answer becomes -4. So it's just following that rule number 4. One negative number means then I have a negative answer. And when I was talking about it doesn't matter if you have the answer already, let's say I have -4 times n equals -8. So now, if I see that, well, I'm going to take that back a step. I'm not going to talk about that yet. I'm going to just go this way with this rule number 1. So if I have one negative, because that's positive, I know this guy's got to be what? Positive or negative? It's got to be positive or negative. It's got to be negative because I have one negative already, and the answer I'm trying to solve, which isn't the answer but a factor, that's got to be -2. So -4 times a -2 equals 8. And that way I know then that had to be a negative sign because I already had a negative. My answer always is going to be negative. This actually leads us into rule number 5 that we're going to talk about. But if I did the problem that we had already, -4 times n equals -8, now I have to look at this and go, well, I have one negative number, but I also have another negative number. So if a negative number turns into a negative answer, then I have to logically think through this and say, oh, wait a minute, that's got to be positive because one negative is going to give me a negative answer, so that has to be positive. And then you, again, can think through regular absolute value numbers. 8, what times 4 gives me 8, and that would be 2. So you have to think through the process, knowing that rule, that one negative gives me a negative answer. And we're going to extend those thoughts here in just a few minutes with this, but I'm going to move on to rule number 5 first. And rule number 5 is sort of what I related to earlier with that problem we just solved. And so if I have two negative numbers in my problem, step 1. Step 2 is my answer is automatically positive. So I have a positive answer. It'll always be positive. If I start with two negatives, I have a positive answer. And then step 3 is, then again, I multiply or divide by absolute value. Just always get rid of your signs. Don't worry about signs when you multiply and divide. Just think of them as absolute values. And then, you know, if you have that, knowing the answer is positive right away, I've got my signs taken care of. So if I look at this problem again, if I have -4 times a -2, or looking at it this way, if I have two negative signs, two negative numbers, I am going to then say right away, and this doesn't hurt anything to put a positive sign there. It's not necessary, we know in math, but if that makes you remember, okay, I've got that taken care of from step 2, then go ahead and do that. So then I go to absolute values, and 4 times 2 is 8. I already have the sign 8. So I have solved that again by the rule. Two negatives turns it into a positive answer that I'm solving, and I just do absolute values again. Don't worry about signs. They're gone, and just do it normally. 4 times 2 is 8, and that gets me to that answer. So two negatives turns positive. Now, what's confusing with this is that what happens when I add two negatives? From the lesson before, if I add two negatives, I get a negative answer. I dug a hole and keep digging when I add negatives. Well, that's what will confuse you in your mind is, oh, I got two negatives, I have a negative answer. Not when I multiply and divide. So that's where you've got to separate those two understandings. When I add negative numbers, I get a negative answer. When I multiply or divide two negative numbers, I get a positive answer. So that will confuse a lot of you, and until you get this skill down, it takes practice, 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 and once you have that process understood, things will go okay for you, but it will be confusing at first. Two negatives, when I multiply and divide, mean positive answer. So what I want to do here for a few exercises is show you some differences here, because when you practice this on page 216 in your journal tomorrow's class, I want you to understand that you've got to think through the process, because sometimes it's confusing if I'm not watching that, because they're going to throw you some different things. The rule of two negatives turning to a positive, or the one negative number turning to a negative answer that we just talked about, only happens when the numbers are being multiplied and divided. So if I have 72 divided by, let's say, -8, and then that's going to be multiplied by, let's say, -2. So we look at this process, there's three numbers here, and remember, we always work with two numbers. And if we work with these first two numbers, 72 divided by 8, all I want to do is look at those two, and I say, how many negatives do I have? And I would say there's one negative, I'm going to have a negative answer. So 72 divided by 8, absolute value, gives me a -9. And then I have this going on that says, okay, now I'm going to take this -2 times that answer of -9. So how many negatives do I have? 2. So that means I have a positive answer. And so 9 times 2, absolute value, is 18. So in this process, I say I have a positive answer when I'm all said and done. When it's all taken care of, I have a positive answer. And you could have looked at that original problem and said, how many negatives do I have in this problem? Oh, 2. I'm going to get a positive answer. So that works okay in that type of problem, because all I'm doing is dividing and multiplying. But if I throw in an addition or a subtraction sign of an operation, that rule goes out the window of how many negatives do I have. So if I had this problem, 72 divided by -8, and then I'm going to add, and remember, this we don't do anymore, but if I'm just going to add a -2, so I'm going to get rid of that plus sign, and it's just going to be a -2 is how you look at that, but that's adding a -2. Now I say two negatives mean, oh, I have a positive answer? No, because I don't have just multiplication and division going. I have adding a -2 number to my problem. So again, we had this problem that we had -9 answer, and then if I do the -2, what does that come up to for an answer is our understanding of negative numbers. I have two negatives I'm adding together, digging the hole. Oh, I have a negative answer of a -11. So now, here's my answer for this problem, and it's still a negative sign. But wait a minute, I started with two negatives. Doesn't that mean I have a positive answer? Not unless it's all multiplying and dividing. That's something that will confuse a lot of us also. If we get stuck in our head, I'm going to look for those two signs or one sign, I'm going to make that answer positive or negative. Once you get into more complicated problems that don't just multiply and divide, they can start adding negative numbers, then you have to just take two numbers at a time, like I did up here. How many negatives do I have? 1. So solve it. And then bring in your next number. How many negatives do I have? 2. Okay, and that must be then a positive answer. So if you do two numbers at a time, just two at a time, you'll be fine. Use the rules that we understand as we go through just two numbers. If you have multiple numbers in a problem, you can run into trouble if I try to get ahead of myself and say, oh, that's a positive or negative answer. That will get you into wrong answers of thinking that way. So take just the two numbers at a time, and you'll process that fine through. So what you want to do is work on page 216 in your journal, and do as many of those problems as you can before class, and then we're going to look at some of those as part of our class to see how you did, and then you'll have also a practice sheet that you'll be working on. So see what you can do, maybe at least half of these. There's a lot of problems there, so try to do at least half of them and see what can happen. A lot of times, if I know there's just multiplying or dividing going on, I will look at, and if there's just two digits we're talking about, I'll look at that number. So -7 times 8, oh, I have one negative. I'm going to put the negative sign in that blank right away. I know it's a negative answer. So you can do that, and a lot of these problems might work that way for you. But as I just demonstrated, we can have problems that will come up that we don't want to process or think about that negative or positive answer until we get to our final operation of whatever two numbers you're working with. So try, practice, and we'll see you tomorrow.